All right, good evening. So there was a little bit of a mishap with the stream, but no matter. Um, so tonight I I don't really want to do this, but it's I guess going to be the second of three commentaries on the trinity in the games industry, and so that is the relationship between the developer, the reviewer, and the player themselves. And I'm not sure which one I'm going to talk about quite yet. We'll see how my mind works after we start talking about the subject in detail. But really, it's just been such a disappointing ride that is Cyberpunk 2077. Not for myself personally. I'm never going to play that game because it's such a safe and unchallenging game, right? Like it's a very, the game itself is very much a stereotype in everything that we see, right? Like in setting, in what appears to be plot. Of course, I haven't played it, so I can't really tell you if, or I can't tell anyone if the game itself is really boring, or just as boring as it appears in every little bit of presentation they've done so far. Because the cyberpunk setting in the Western world is so ingrained and so consistent that that it's such cliche. Anyway, that's not even the point here. The point here is, the point of this recording is actually to talk about what happened between the developers and the reviewers, and between the reviewers and the gamers themselves, and then between the gamers and the developers. And it's such an interesting little story, right? At the end of the day, to summarize, we can say that the developer said, oh, the game needs more time. And then the player said, how dare you? How dare you need more time for such a game? And so the developer said, fine, this is going to be our last extension. And then they released a game that didn't work quite as well as it should. And then the player said, how dare you release a game that doesn't work? And everybody here technically has a point. Technically. And that's as far as I can go. Right? Because the developer shouldn't overpromise, obviously. And also should not release a game that doesn't work. Of course, having said that, the developer also can't really release a game that only works on one console and doesn't work on another console. That's obviously not right. Managing expectation is obviously part of that, and I haven't actually delved into the finances behind CD Projekt Red, but it didn't feel like that they were that desperate for money. So I can only assume that this was done because they wanted to maintain some form of how should we say, maintain the game coming out in 2020, since that was the original promise. But 2020 has been such a extraordinary year that we're getting to the other side of the Holy Trinity now, and that is, developers tend to listen to the most vocal fans, and that for obvious reasons, because the most vocal fans are the ones that say the most things, and therefore seem to reflect the public opinion the most. But that's not the case, and I think the gaming industry in general is still too young to understand that. Look at like, actually no, I'm not gonna bring up other examples. Essentially, or maybe CD Projekt Red it considers itself a smaller company, and therefore cannot do what what cannot do what a bigger company would do in similar case. It's just, yeah. Anyway, so talking about the fans for a second. Fans are interesting, aren't they? They're sort of whom we target and whom we make money off of. So obviously we have to keep them happy. But keeping them happy is sort of, you have to first have a compelling product. If you have crap and you're trying to feed someone crap, they can only stand crap for so long before they can't, they won't believe it anymore. And I think fans in general are already jaded enough that they're not gonna take any shit, right? and so it's up to the studio to phrase their I mean, obviously, first of all, they shouldn't have said, or no, that's not true. First of all, when they first pushed it back, they shouldn't have given themselves such a tight deadline. They should have just done what Halo did and just said, nah, sometime in 2021, who gives a fuck? and that's, well, I mean, partly I'm sure Halo did it because they saw what kind of crap that 2077 did, but that's still the point. You cannot and should not put yourself under such a tight deadline that you might not miss it. It's better to underpromise and overdeliver than overpromise and underdeliver, because disappointment will always overshadow any amount of excitement. Like the game can run gold. The game can dispense like dollar bills on a PS5, but it would mean nothing if it then like gives you cancer when you play it on PS4, right? Like that's that's just not how that works. And so and so managing that expectation was obviously not done very well. But really, as the gaming audience itself, they are also quite I mean, everyone in this holy trinity of reviewers, developers, and fans are unreasonable, just because that's apparently what our society is like these days, right? I've talked at length about why the reviewers are, why I don't appreciate modern gaming reviews. So like there are reasons, right? And so the fan backlash, we can consider, if we take a step back, we can actually consider the idea that as a whole, the player community is much less progressive than both the reviewers and the developers. And there are obvious reasons for that, because I mean, last time I've already talked about a few, some of which are, things like writing and tech are more progressive dominated, simply because they are things that are taken up more by those who are more progressive. So whether that means more education or other progressive causes I don't want to get into, doesn't really factor in, as long as like as a whole, the tech, the tech and tech review world slants progressive compared to the base population, and the base population is the only population that we can really take for the gaming population, and so therefore we it stands to reason. I mean, and it's just obvious, at least to me, that the average gamer is less progressive than the average developer or the average reviewer. And so the problem there arises then, right? Like, it doesn't even matter if the average gamer is reactionary for reactionary's sake, for giggles, or because they truly believe it, because the end effect is always the same, and that's that amplification of that culture war that inevitably happens. And so by over promising, under delivering, and catering to a population that in itself is not, and I'm talking about the player population now, catering to a population that in itself doesn't really understand, as a cohort, doesn't understand the intricacies and complexities of what's going on. Developers are setting themselves up for failure. That's just how that works. And so the question is, and so the question then becomes, why, right? Like, it's hard to, I guess unless we drag some game designers and project managers out, or we subpoena for their meeting minutes, we're never going to understand why they didn't push it back further, because obviously the fact that the PS4 and Xbox, whatever versions shipped and play like crap, is a huge deal, and such a big failure for a developer that's, been around for so long, right? This is before The Witcher 1, and to think that they could just, like, that somehow QA would let them do that. Obviously QA wouldn't have. Obviously someone inside there overruled that and said it's okay, they're all idiots anyway, just release the damn game. And it's just so fascinating, because whoever made the ultimate decision to release that game obviously knew that the game would not run on PS4 and Xbox previous gen, and in fact would run like crap on the average gaming computer, right? Like we're talking what, like, we're talking like NVIDIA 1060, what the 570 RT 570 whatever from Team Red, and so AMD, of course. and so whoever made that decision considered the fact that the average player, which actually, let's go back and define the average player. The average player does not have a PS5, the average player doesn't have next gen, and the average player doesn't have a top of the range gaming computer. And so therefore the average player cannot play Cyberpunk 2077 at the rate, at the way it was intended. And so whoever okayed the release of Cyberpunk 2077 definitely thought it was more important to cater to that promise of not having another delay, then thinks that promise is more important than shipping a product that works. And there are obvious reasons for that, right? Like fear of the fans is obviously one of them. But something else then comes up, and that's another fear, and that's the fear of crunching And when we say crunch, we mean making employees work dramatic more overtime just to make sure a product gets out on time and properly tested. And the industry itself has been facing a reckoning in that in that in that in that it was standard practice, and it remains. I shouldn't. We'll not talk about this. Suffice it to say that the industry itself is still working out how to work this, how to make the same game in the same time with less human resources, and that's obviously like, what are you gonna do? That's basically impossible. So there are reasons for that, right? Like, we can't. They don't want to crunch because it's bad for publicity and it's bad for the employees. Which one's more important? We don't really know, and honestly, it doesn't matter for this particular conversation. The point there being, they didn't want to crunch anymore, they didn't want to crunch harder, and therefore they released a game that was a piece of crap, and suffered for it. But I guess if there was any concluding or summary to this 15-minute rant that I just did, it's that I don't think it's the developer's fault. I don't think I genuinely I think in terms of releasing a piece of crap that doesn't work on the majority of gamers, actually ends up not being the developer's fault, for the simple reason that whoever okayed this release was more afraid of pushing the release date back than of releasing a piece of shit. And that should tell you something about this society and what it's doing to these developers. Let's not forget that there were, who knows if they were genuine or not, but threats of violence against CD Projekt Red the first time they pushed back the release of Cyberpunk 2077. And so that's, yeah. In summary, get Firefox, don't use Chrome. I'm just gonna end with that every time from now on. Get Firefox. Yeah.